So, you might have heard of Satan, right? And you might have also heard of a game called Dungeons and Dragons. Contrary to the widely spread belief from the 80s, these two things have absolutely nothing to do with each other. So, maybe you don't really care about Dungeons and Dragons, right? But you probably have friends or family who play and who might have had their lives affected by people's views on them and this game that they play. Having played several years worth of D&D and nearly having been forced to stop because of these misconceptions, I've experienced how this can affect both the game and the people playing it. There is a widespread myth that D&D causes suicide through some satanic means, which is just that, an untrue, unfounded myth. Today, I will first tell you the problem with how D&D is sometimes viewed, and then how these things are untrue, and finish with how these views can be combated. To begin, let's start with the current problem. People believe that D&D causes players to commit suicide. This myth stems from several incidents, really, in the 1980s where 16-year-olds committed suicide. The BBC, in a report about this, found that in 1979, a 16-year-old named James Dallas Egbert went missing in his school's sewer tunnels and later killed himself about a year later, in fact. The private investigator that his parents hired to find him after he went missing suggested Dungeons and Dragons as a reason that he might have gone missing. However, it was later found that he had other problems going on in his life. He was using substances and he was depressed. And when the BBC followed up with this reporter, they found that that was never said that Dungeons and Dragons was strictly the cause. It was said that it could have been a reason. The fact that there were outside factors that overlooked this boy's untimely demise that were overlooked in the first place were ultimately the beginning of a stigma against a game that doesn't deserve it. Another incident that added fuel to this fire was that of Irving Pulling, who played in a school-sanctioned D&D game at his high school and killed himself. In a CBRA article that was collecting data about the Dungeons and Dragons scare, it was reported that Pulling's mother sued the school after her son died, saying that the game was to blame, even after the case was dismissed. Because of course it was dismissed, she still held a grudge against the game, which manifested as the creation of one of the primary fear-mongering groups about Dungeons and Dragons, called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Very creative name. This group claimed that the game partook in every bad thing that you could think of, from Satanism to cults to rape, and suggested that its players do the same. This shows that despite a lack of evidence supporting Pulling's claim, and in fact a plethora of evidence supporting otherwise, the refusal to believe that the game was not to blame really just fueled the fire and helped it spiral out of control. Now that we know a little bit about the history of the problem, we can talk about why this is decidedly untrue. There is nothing in the game that would encourage suicide or Satanism or to go join a cult. D&D is at its core a storytelling game run by the players. A writer for the original Dungeons and Dragons base game addressed concerns that the game would affect the kids mentally, turning them into Satanists or causing them to join a cult. One of the common misconceptions, for example, that came up very often was you cast spells in this game. People outside the hobby were taking the fiction literally and thinking that these spells were real. This writer understands what happened. People were thinking that the spells that you cast in game, where you simply say, I cast Fireball, and you roll a dice to see if it works, people were thinking that that was actually casting a physical spell in the real world, which really added on to the idea that this was a cult or something sacrilegious. By not looking into the game further or seemingly having common sense to know that you're not casting a real spell, people who were against it failed to see how the game had nothing to do with their fears. I've also had encounters like this from my own family. When I first started playing, my mom tried to get me to stop several times, claiming that it was Satanistic, claiming that it was against, like, against everything she believed in, saying that she was worried for me. And eventually I sat her down and explained the game, explained the story we were telling, and she had to admit that there was nothing bad about it. Now that we've seen how this all started and how it affects others, let's look at the solution for the problem. The majority of the misconceptions based around the game can be dismissed or put people's mind at ease simply by looking more into the game. Of course, some people won't be willing to look further into a game that they might never play, but because of the amount of people that do play the game and are affected about these misconceptions, it might be worth it to learn even a little bit about the mechanics of the game. It's very easy to look into through just watching an episode of one of the many podcasts that explain the game or are simply a glimpse into the game others are playing. These include shows like Critical Role, The Broadswords, and The Adventure Zone, all of which explain the game through storytelling. There are also small videos, easy to digest and very funny, on YouTube, such as the ones like Joe Cat, who makes a crap guide to D&D, where the mechanics of the game are explained in a very short, concise, and easy to digest fashion. Simply learning the basics of the game or even listening in on someone else's game can help assuage fears for those who might be nervous about what happens in the game itself. Now that we've talked about a long-standing problem in the D&D community, let's review what we just talked about. Dungeons and Dragons has no negative bearing on the player's mental health and certainly has no way to force the players to kill it themselves. We started by addressing the problem, which is that people believe that the game D&D causes players to commit suicide, and then established that this was caused from several isolated incidents and a lack of understanding about the game. We concluded with a solution of how to fix this by simply suggesting ways to show how someone can learn at least the basics of the game. With a small hint of knowledge about the game, D&D's lingering reputation could easily disappear from the minds of those who both play it and those who know what it is. So now that you're educated about it, next time you hear your friends playing, don't worry, they're safe.